The catfish cancer that isn't growing from pollution. It's spreading like an infection. For 14 years, a lake on the Vermont-Quebec border has been watching a third of its catfish grow black tumors. Scientists assumed it was contamination. They were wrong about what kind of threat it actually was. The tumors did not come from the water. That was the assumption from the very beginning, and it was a reasonable one. Brown bullhead catfish are what biologists call a sentinel species. Bottom-dwelling fish that develop liver tumors when the water around them is contaminated with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the toxic byproducts of industrial pollution. When something is wrong with a lake, the bullhead are often the first ones to show it in their own tissue. So when anglers on Lake Memphremagog, which straddles the border between Vermont and Quebec, started pulling up brown bullhead with raised black lesions, patches that looked, in the words of one biologist, like tar smeared across the skin, the obvious explanation was contamination, runoff, a spill, something in the water. It took researchers more than a decade to prove that explanation wrong, and to discover that what was actually spreading through this fish population was something rarer and stranger than pollution, a transmissible cancer, a form of the disease that does not start fresh in each individual body, but travels between bodies like a parasite or an infection, carrying its own genome from one fish to the next. This is that story. Peter Emerson, a fish biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, had been surveying Lake Memphremagog since 2009. In 2012, an angler brought him a bullhead unlike anything he had seen in 3 years of fieldwork. A fish with black growths smeared across its body. Within 3 years, those same growths were showing up on a quarter to 40% of the lake's bullhead population. The first hypothesis was the obvious one. In 2011, Tropical Storm Irene had torn through Vermont, flooding the watershed and stirring up sediment. Researchers tested for the hydrocarbon contamination that typically causes bullhead liver tumors, suspecting the storm had released a buried source of pollution into the lake. The results did not fit. Waters with far higher levels of contamination elsewhere in the region held fish with clean, healthy skin. Lake Memphremagog's tumor rate did not track with pollution levels at all, so the researchers changed direction. Starting around 2014, tissue samples went to the bioinformatics core at the University of Vermont for genetic sequencing, on the assumption that if it wasn't a chemical contaminant, it might be a virus, the same way a retrovirus is known to cause skin sarcomas in walleye. Year after year of sequencing turned up nothing. No virus, no bacterium, no microbe of any kind that could explain what was spreading through the lake. What they eventually found, once they stopped looking for a pathogen and started looking at the tumor cells themselves, was even more surprising than a new virus would have been. Julie Dragon, a researcher at the University of Vermont Cancer Center and co-leader of the study, and her colleagues ran whole genome sequencing on tumor tissue and matched it against healthy tissue from the same fish and against tissue from unaffected fish elsewhere. What they found broke the basic rule that cancer is supposed to follow. A tumor is supposed to look genetically like the body that grew it, because it started as that body's own cells gone wrong. These tumors did not look like the fish they came from. They looked like each other. Hundreds of thousands of genetic variants were shared across tumor samples taken from different fish, variants that were completely absent from each of those fish's own healthy tissue. The tumor genomes were more closely related to one another, fish to fish, than any of them were to their own host. That pattern, at that scale, does not happen with an ordinary cancer that starts fresh inside one animal. It happens when cancer cells themselves are the thing moving from body to body, spreading the way an infectious organism spreads, carrying an unbroken lineage of malignant cells forward from host to host to host. That makes the Lake Memphremagog bullhead only the 4th documented case, anywhere in the animal kingdom, of a naturally occurring transmissible cancer after a sexually transmitted tumor lineage in dogs that has persisted for thousands of years, 2 independent facial tumor lineages devastating Tasmanian devils, and several distinct cancer lineages that spread through populations of clams, cockles, and mussels. It is the first ever documented in a fish. It is the first ever documented in freshwater. Here's the honest version of this story. Because more than a decade in, the researchers still don't have all the answers. They don't know exactly how the cancer moves from one bullhead to another. The leading hypothesis involves spawning behavior bullhead cluster tightly together during their reproductive season, coming into close physical contact, and the tumor cells appear to shed easily, breaking apart at the lightest touch. A cell dislodged from one fish during spawning contact, landing in an open wound or abrasion on another, is one plausible route. It hasn't been proven. They don't know exactly where it started. One theory holds that the disease began as a random mutation in a single fish, possibly one made more vulnerable by the same post-storm pollution stress that researchers originally suspected as the direct cause. Weakened immune defenses opening the door for a mutant cell line to survive and spread, rather than pollution causing the mutation directly. The other theory is more mundane. A single infected fish, introduced from another body of water, where the disease was already quietly circulating, seeded the whole outbreak in Memphremagog. And they don't know yet which kind of transmissible cancer this is going to turn out to be. That distinction matters enormously. The Tasmanian devil's facial tumor disease is a death sentence at population scale. It has wiped out roughly 90% of some wild devil populations since it was first identified. The canine transmissible tumor, by contrast, has coexisted with dogs for thousands of years without driving the species anywhere near collapse. Bullhead with the black lesions can, in some cases, survive for years. Some of the affected fish researchers have sampled are old animals that have evidently been living with the disease for a long time. In other cases, the cancer spreads internally to the brain or liver. Nobody yet knows which outcome is more common, or what it will mean for the lake's bullhead population over the coming decades. What researchers do feel confident about is that the disease poses no danger to people. Lake Memphremagog supplies drinking water to more than 175,000 residents on both sides of the border, and the tumor cells cannot infect or survive in a species other than brown bullhead. Quebec's Ministry of the Environment recommends against eating fish with visible tumors as a precaution. Dragon herself has said she believes the fish are safe to eat. Tumors are not, and that Vermonters sometimes do. There's a strange historical footnote buried in all of this. Spotted, blemished brown bullhead were described by the naturalist Henry David Thoreau, writing about Massachusetts ponds in the 1850s. More than a century and a half before anyone had the genetic tools to recognize what they might actually have been looking at. It raises a question the research team has started asking out loud. How rare is this disease really, or have transmissible cancers simply been sitting in wild populations for generations, unnoticed because nobody had a reason to sequence a tumor's genome against its own host's tissue until now? Michael Metzger, a biologist at the Pacific Northwest Research Institute who studies transmissible cancers in bivalves, has said he wasn't surprised that a fourth transmissible cancer had been found in nature, but he did not expect it to turn up in a freshwater species. Dragon has gone further, suggesting the assumption that these cancers are vanishingly rare may simply reflect how rarely anyone looks for them. Crowdsourced photographs from anglers, ordinary people posting pictures of strange-looking fish online, have already helped researchers track how far the black lesions have spread across other lakes in New England and Quebec, catching a slow-moving biological event at a scale no research survey alone could match. Somewhere in Lake Memphremagog tonight, in the sediment along the bottom where brown bullheads spend their lives, a fish carrying the disease is settling in for the night beside fish that don't have it yet. It doesn't know it's carrying a lineage of cells that outdates its own life cells, that started dividing inside some other bullhead, possibly years ago, possibly in another body of water entirely, and never stopped. When spawning season comes again, some of those cells may find a new host. The tumor will not have been born in that fish, it will simply have arrived. That is what a transmissible cancer actually is, not a disease an animal develops, but a disease an animal catches, a genome that outlives its original owner and keeps moving forward, fish to fish, generation after generation, indifferent to the boundary that is supposed to exist between one body and the next. Tell us in the comments, if a cancer can move from body to body like an infection, does the animal you catch it from even matter anymore? Or is the tumor itself the real organism here? Subscribe, because the strangest diseases in nature are always the ones that don't play by the rules we assumed applied.